The thunderous crack of lightning split the sky as Clara Foster clutched her sodden shawl around her shoulders, her feet sinking into the mud with each desperate step she took across the barren Kansas plain. Everything she had known was gone, swept away in a moment of nature's fury. Another life to rebuild, another heartbreak to endure in this unforgiving frontier they called the West. It was April 1878, and spring storms in Kansas were as merciless as the winter blizzards. Clara had watched in horror as the twister descended from the churning clouds, tearing apart the small homestead she'd called home for the past year. The roof had gone first, peeling away like paper, followed by the walls that had sheltered her since her father's passing. Now, at 22, she was alone again with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's pocket watch clutched in her trembling hand. Rain lashed at her face as she squinted into the darkness, searching for any sign of shelter. The faint glow of a lantern in the distance was like a beacon of hope. She stumbled forward, her sodden skirts heavy around her ankles, her lungs burning as she gasped for breath. The light grew stronger, illuminating the outline of a modest cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. Clara's heart pounded as she approached. Whoever lived there might turn her away, a bedraggled stranger appearing in the dead of night. But with the storm intensifying and nowhere else to go, she had no choice but to try. Her knuckles rapped weakly against the wooden door. For a moment there was no response, and she feared the cabin might be abandoned. Then came the sound of footsteps, solid and unhurried. The door swung open, revealing a tall man silhouetted against the warm glow of a fire. "Good Lord, woman, what are you doing out in this?" His voice was deep, tinged with a hint of Texas in its cadence. "My home," Clara managed between chattering teeth. "The storm, it's gone." Without hesitation, he stepped aside. "Come in before you catch your death." Clara stumbled across the threshold, water pooling at her feet on the rough wooden floor. The man closed the door against the howling wind, shutting out the chaos of the storm. In the firelight, she could see him clearly now, broad-shouldered with tanned skin that spoke of long days under the sun. His features were sharp but not unkind, his eyes the color of the prairie sky. A streak of premature silver cut through his otherwise dark hair, though he couldn't have been more than 30. "Xavier Irons," he said simply, moving to stoke the fire. "Sit before you collapse." Clara sank onto a chair by the hearth, her trembling hands extended toward the flames. "Clara Foster," she replied. "I'm sorry to impose like this." Xavier shook his head as he draped a worn blanket around her shoulders. "No imposition when the alternative is leaving you to die in that storm." He moved about the small cabin with practiced efficiency, putting a kettle on to boil and retrieving a clean shirt and pair of trousers from a trunk at the foot of his narrow bed. "These will be too big, but they're dry," he said, placing them on the table beside her. "You can change behind that screen while I make some coffee. You look like you could use something strong." Clara nodded gratefully, too exhausted to feel embarrassment. Behind the privacy screen, she peeled off her soaked dress and undergarments. Using a cloth Xavier had provided to dry herself before pulling on his offered clothes. The shirt hung past her thighs, the trousers requiring several rolls at the waist and ankles to stay in place. But the feeling of dry fabric against her skin was blissful. When she emerged, Xavier had a steaming mug waiting. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth that seeped into her cold fingers. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found your cabin." Xavier settled into a chair across from her, his own mug in hand. "Where was your home?" "About 5 miles east," Clara replied. "My father and I claimed the land last year. He died in the winter pneumonia. I've been managing alone since January." "No other family," Clara shook her head. "Just me now." Xavier studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "The storm's likely to last through the night. You'll stay here." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "Just until morning. I should go back, see what can be salvaged." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. Clara felt herself swaying in her chair as exhaustion overwhelmed her. "Bed's yours tonight," Xavier said, rising. "I'll take the chair." "I couldn't possibly." "You could and you will," he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You're dead on your feet, Miss Foster." Too tired to argue, Clara allowed him to guide her to the bed in the corner of the cabin. The simple frame held a straw mattress covered with clean linens that smelled of sunshine and open air. As soon as her head touched the pillow, darkness began to claim her. Through the fog of encroaching sleep, she heard Xavier's quiet voice. "Stay as long as you need," he said. Then, almost too soft to hear, he added, "Stay forever." Clara wasn't certain she'd heard him correctly, and before she could question it, sleep pulled her under completely. Morning came with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the small window beside the bed. Clara woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night rushed back, and she sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in her muscles from her desperate flight through the storm. Xavier was already awake, tending to something on the small iron stove. He glanced over his shoulder at her movement. "Good morning." "Thought you might sleep through the day." Clara pushed back the covers, suddenly self-conscious in his borrowed clothes. "What time is it?" "Just past 8, he replied, turning back to his cooking. "Storm broke about an hour ago, made quite a mess of things outside." Clara moved to the window, gasping at the sight. Branches littered the ground, and a large cottonwood had been uprooted completely, its massive trunk lying like a fallen giant near the small barn behind the cabin. "Your barn, is it damaged?" Xavier shrugged. "Roof needs patching, but the horses are fine. That's what matters." He scooped eggs from the pan onto 2 tin plates. "Come eat. You'll need your strength if you're determined to see what's left of your place." Clara joined him at the table, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since midday the previous day. The eggs were seasoned simply but cooked perfectly, accompanied by thick slices of bread slathered with butter. "You're a good cook, Mr. Irons," she commented after several hungry bites. "Xavier," he corrected. "And necessity teaches a man many things. Been cooking for myself since I was 16. Your family," a shadow passed over his features. "Gone, war took my father, mother followed not long after, brother died at Shiloh." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "The war took much from many." Xavier nodded but offered nothing more on the subject. Instead, he asked, "What did you and your father farm on your homestead?" "Wheat, mostly," Clara replied. "Had a good crop last year. Father was hopeful for this season too." She sighed, setting down her fork. "All gone now, I suppose." "Maybe not all," Xavier said. "Twisters are strange things. They can take one building and leave another standing right beside it untouched. Will you come with me?" The question surprised even Clara herself. "To see what's left, I mean." Xavier studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'll saddle the horses after breakfast." An hour later, they rode side by side across the rain-soaked prairie. Clara wore her own dress again, now mostly dry after hanging by the fire overnight. Xavier had insisted she keep his woolen coat, however, against the morning chill. As they crested a low rise, Clara's breath caught in her throat. Where her modest homestead had once stood was now a scene of devastation. The house was completely gone, scattered across the prairie in 1,000 splintered pieces. The small barn lay in ruins, its walls collapsed inward. Only the stone foundation of the house and the root cellar remained intact. Clara dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady as she approached what had been her home. Xavier followed, keeping a respectful distance as she surveyed the destruction. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything is gone." Xavier remained silent, allowing her the moment to absorb the reality of her loss. Clara moved carefully through the debris, occasionally stooping to retrieve some small item that had survived: a dented tin cup, a tarnished silver spoon, a sodden book with pages plastered together. She clutched each one briefly before setting it aside, knowing their worth was now only sentimental. The root cellar doors had held, and Clara descended the earthen steps with Xavier following. Inside, jars of preserves lined the shelves, undisturbed by the storm that had ravaged everything above. Clara ran her fingers over the glass containers: peaches, beans, corn, tomatoes, the fruits of last summer's labor. "At least these survived," she said, her voice hollow. "We can take them back," Xavier offered. "I've got room in my saddlebags." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Together, they filled Xavier's saddlebags with as many jars as they could safely carry. leaving the rest for another trip. As they emerged from the cellar, Clara's gaze fell on a small mound of fresh dirt a short distance from the house foundation. Xavier followed her line of sight. "Your father?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, moving toward the simple grave. The wooden cross she'd fashioned was still standing, though listing slightly from the storm. She straightened it, her fingers lingering on the rough surface. "He would have known what to do," she said, more to herself than to Xavier. "He always knew." Xavier removed his hat, holding it respectfully at his chest. "What will you do now, Clara?" She stared at the ruined homestead, reality settling cold and heavy in her chest. "I don't know. I have no money for lumber to rebuild, no family to take me in." "You could stay," Xavier said, then quickly clarified, "at my place until you figure things out. I've got the room." Clara turned to study him, trying to discern his intentions. His expression remained open, sincere. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know you're alone and in need," he replied simply. "And I've space enough for two. Seems straightforward to me." Clara looked once more at what remained of her home, then back to Xavier. "I can't accept charity." "Then don't call it that," he said. "Call it neighborly assistance. You can help around the place. I could use an extra pair of hands with spring planting coming." Clara hesitated. The offer was tempting, but she'd been raised to be self-reliant. Accepting help, especially from a man she barely knew, went against everything her father had taught her. Yet what choice did she have? "Just until I can get back on my feet," she conceded finally. "And I'll work to earn my keep." Xavier nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. "Let's gather what else we can and head back. We can return tomorrow for more." They combed through the wreckage for another hour, salvaging what little remained intact: a cast iron skillet, a few articles of clothing that had caught in the branches of a nearby tree, her father's Bible with its sodden pages. Each item was precious now, a tangible connection to the life that had been swept away. As they prepared to leave, Clara paused at her father's grave once more. "I'll be back, Papa," she whispered, brushing her fingers across the wooden cross. "I promise." The ride back to Xavier's cabin was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara tried to make sense of how dramatically her circumstances had changed in less than a day. Yesterday morning, she'd been an independent woman with a home and purpose. Now she was dependent on the kindness of a stranger. Xavier's voice broke through her thoughts as his cabin came into view. "It's not much," he said, "but it's sturdy. Built it myself 3 years ago." "It's more than I have," Clara replied, "and I'm grateful." He helped her dismount before leading the horses to the barn. Clara carried their salvaged items inside, setting them carefully on the table. The cabin felt different in daylight, smaller perhaps, but tidier than she might have expected for a man living alone. A few books were stacked neatly on a shelf, the floor was swept clean, and everything seemed to have its proper place. Xavier returned a short while later, bringing in an armload of firewood. "Weather's turning again," he commented, nodding toward the window where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Spring in Kansas, never know what you're going to get." Clara moved to the stove. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the cooking area. "It's all yours," Xavier replied, setting down the wood. "I'll go see to a few things in the barn before the rain starts." When he returned an hour later, Clara had transformed the humble ingredients she found in his cupboard into a hearty stew. The cabin was filled with the rich aroma of simmering meat and vegetables, a welcome change from the simple fare Xavier typically prepared for himself. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene of Clara stirring the pot, her hair tied back with a piece of string, her movements confident and practiced. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling of rightness he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Smells good," he said, closing the door behind him. Clara looked up, offering a small smile. "Found some venison in your cold box. Hope you don't mind." "Not at all." Xavier hung his hat on a peg by the door, was saving it for something special anyway. They ate together as rain began to tap against the windows, the approaching storm casting the cabin in premature twilight. Xavier's compliments on the meal were sparse but genuine, and Clara found herself warming to his straightforward manner. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they finished eating. "You said you've been here 3 years." Xavier nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Came west after the war. Tried my hand at a few things: cattle driving, horse breaking, saved enough to claim this land in '75. Got about 50 head of cattle now, 10 horses. Small operation, but it's mine. And you manage it alone? Clara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Hire help for roundup and branding, he replied. Rest of the time, it's just me. He paused, studying her across the table. What about you? Your father must have taught you well if you were managing that homestead on your own. Clara nodded, warming her hands around her coffee cup. Papa believed a woman should know how to take care of herself. Taught me to shoot, ride, farm, everything he knew. A sad smile touched her lips. Said I'd make some man a fine partner someday, though I never seemed to meet one who agreed. Their loss, Xavier said simply. The rain intensified, drumming steadily on the roof. Clara gathered their plates, moving to wash them in the basin by the stove. Xavier watched her for a moment before standing. I'll make up a pallet for myself by the fire, he said. You can take the bed again tonight. Clara turned, shaking her head. I can't keep taking your bed. You're not taking it if I'm offering, Xavier pointed out. Besides, you've had a shock. Need proper rest. Clara wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Thank you, she said instead. But tomorrow we'll find a better arrangement. Xavier's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. As you say. As darkness fell completely, they settled into a companionable silence. Xavier whittled a piece of wood by the fire while Clara mended a tear in one of her salvaged garments. The simple domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly how natural it felt to be sharing this space with him, despite having known him for less than a day. What are you making? She asked, nodding toward his hands. Xavier glanced down at the wood taking shape beneath his knife. Just passing time, he said, though Clara could see the emerging form of a small bird. You're skilled, she observed. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Keeps my hands busy in the evenings. Later, as Clara lay in Xavier's bed listening to the rain, she found herself wondering about the man sleeping by the fire. He was a mystery, reserved yet kind, seemingly content with his solitary existence, yet willing to open his home to a stranger in need. What had shaped him? What had brought him to this remote corner of Kansas to live alone? And why, when he'd thought she was asleep, had he whispered those words? Stay forever, had she imagined it? Perhaps it was merely the exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. Yet the words had seemed so clear, so earnest. Sleep came eventually, but Clara's dreams were turbulent, filled with swirling winds and the sound of splintering wood, interspersed with glimpses of Xavier's steady gaze across a firelit room. The following days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, they would ride to Clara's ruined homestead, salvaging what they could and gathering materials that might be repurposed. Xavier helped her retrieve the remaining preserves from the root cellar and assisted in the painful task of sorting through the debris for any personal items that might have survived. On the third day, they discovered her father's trunk half buried in mud nearly 50 yards from where the house had stood. The lock had held, and inside, Clara found treasures she'd thought lost forever: her mother's wedding band, a daguerreotype of her parents, letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small leather pouch containing $20 gold, her father's emergency fund. A fortune, Xavier commented as Clara counted the coins with trembling fingers. Enough to start again, perhaps, she said, hope kindling in her chest. I could rebuild a smaller place, but something of my own. Xavier's expression remained carefully neutral. Could, he agreed. But winter wheat won't be harvested until July. Building takes time. What would you live on until then? Clara's momentary optimism faltered. I could find work in town. Concordia must need seamstresses or laundresses. It does, Xavier acknowledged. But the pay is poor, and the work is harder than you might think. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Irons, Clara replied, a hint of steel in her voice. Xavier raised his hands in surrender. Never suggested you were. Just pointing out that $20 won't stretch as far as you might hope. Clara carefully returned the coins to their pouch. Nevertheless, it gives me options I didn't have yesterday. They rode back to Xavier's cabin in silence that day, a subtle tension between them that hadn't existed before. Clara couldn't understand why the prospect of her independence seemed to trouble him, and Xavier offered no explanation for his reticence. That evening, as they sat down to the rabbit stew Clara had prepared, Xavier finally spoke what was on his mind. "My offer still stands," he said, his gaze fixed on his plate. "To stay, not just temporarily." Clara set down her fork. "Why would you want that?" Xavier looked up, his blue eyes intent. "Because in 3 days, you've made this place more of a home than I managed in 3 years. By cooking a few meals, tidying up," Clara shook her head. "That's hardly reason to invite someone to stay permanently." "It's more than that," Xavier insisted. He trailed off, clearly struggling to articulate his thoughts. "Before you came, I didn't realize how empty this place was. Now I do." Clara studied him across the table, trying to read the emotion behind his typically stoic expression. "Are you proposing an arrangement of convenience, Mr. Irons?" "Xavier," he corrected automatically. "And no, not convenience, at least not only that." "Then what exactly are you proposing?" Xavier set down his spoon, his gaze direct. "I'm not good with words, Clara, never have been. But I know what feels right, and you being here feels right." "You barely know me," Clara pointed out. "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're strong, you managed that homestead alone for months. I know you're kind, you've shown more gratitude for the little I've done than most would. And I know that when I rode out with you today and watched you find that trunk, all I could think was how much I dreaded you leaving." Clara felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "That's not a proposal, Xavier, I don't know what that is." A rare smile touched his lips. "It's the truth. The proposal would be, stay, help me build something here. We could do well together, I think." "As what? Partners, neighbors under one roof?" "As whatever you're comfortable with," Xavier said carefully. "I won't presume more than you're willing to give." Clara stood abruptly, needing space to think. "This is unexpected." "I know," Xavier acknowledged. "And I'm not asking for an answer today, just asking you to consider it before you decide to rebuild or take work in town." Clara moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening prairie. The offer was startling in its simplicity and its implications. Xavier wasn't proposing marriage, not explicitly, but something nearly as binding. A life shared, a future built together. And yet, was it so different from what she'd planned with her father? They had been partners too, each contributing their strengths to their shared enterprise. Could she do the same with Xavier? "I need time," she said finally, turning back to him. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." Xavier nodded, relief evident in his posture. He hadn't expected her to reject the idea outright. "Take all the time you need." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but Clara remained distracted, turning Xavier's proposal over in her mind. It was pragmatic. Certainly she needed a home, and he needed help managing his ranch. But was there more to it than that? The way he looked at her sometimes suggested deeper feelings, yet he'd been careful not to speak of them directly. As they prepared for sleep that night, Clara insisting on taking the pallet by the fire despite Xavier's protests, she found herself studying him covertly. He was handsome in a rugged way, his features weathered by sun and wind, his movements deliberate and sure. There was a steadiness to him that Clara found appealing, a quiet strength that spoke of a man who knew his own mind and followed his own path. Could she build a life with such a man? Could what began as an arrangement of mutual benefit grow into something more? Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams a confused jumble of images: her father's grave, Xavier's steady gaze, her ruined homestead, the small cabin that was rapidly beginning to feel like home. Morning dawned clear and bright, the April sun warming the prairie with the promise of spring. Clara rose early, building up the fire and starting coffee before Xavier stirred. When he emerged from behind the privacy screen, already dressed for the day's work, he paused at the sight of her standing by the stove. "You're up early," he commented, reaching for the coffee she offered. "Couldn't sleep," Clara admitted. "Too much on my mind." Xavier nodded, accepting this without pressing for details. "Thought we might ride into Concordia today," he said after a moment. "Need supplies, and you should see the town if you're considering it as an option." Clara agreed, grateful for the opportunity to explore alternatives. They set out after breakfast, riding side by side across the rolling prairie. The ride to town took nearly 2 hours. during which Xavier pointed out landmarks and neighboring homesteads, giving Clara a better sense of the area she now found herself in. Concordia was larger than Clara had expected a proper town, with several streets radiating from a central square. The main thoroughfare boasted a variety of businesses: a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, and various shops catering to the needs of the surrounding farming community. "Town's growing," Xavier commented as they tied their horses at a hitching post outside the general store. "Railroad came through last year, brought more settlers." They entered the store together, Xavier nodding to the proprietor, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers who greeted him by name. "Mr. Irons, good to see you," the man called. "Been a while since you made it to town." "Been busy, Mr. Perkins," Xavier replied, then gestured to Clara. "This is Miss Foster, lost her place in the storm last week." Mr. Perkins's expression shifted to one of sympathy. "Terrible business, those twisters, been more of them than usual this spring." He turned to Clara. "Sorry for your loss, Miss Foster." "Thank you," Clara replied. "It's been difficult, but Mr. Irons has been very kind." Mr. Perkins raised an eyebrow at this, glancing between them with evident curiosity but made no comment. Instead, he asked, "What can I get for you today?" Xavier handed over a list of supplies while Clara browsed the store, noting prices and mentally calculating what her 20 gold dollars might purchase. The cost of lumber alone would consume most of her savings, leaving little for other necessities. The reality of her situation became increasingly clear. Rebuilding on her own would be nearly impossible without going into debt. As they moved through town afterward, Xavier introduced her to several people: the blacksmith, the doctor, the postmaster. Each expressed sympathy for her loss, and several mentioned possible employment opportunities, though none seemed particularly promising. "Mrs. Henderson at the hotel might need help with laundry," suggested the postmaster's wife. "And I heard the Wilsons were looking for a governess for their children, though they can't pay much." Clara thanked her for the information, her heart sinking further. The work was available, but as Xavier had warned, the pay would be meager, barely enough to rent a room, let alone rebuild a home. They ate a simple midday meal at the hotel dining room, Clara pushing her food around her plate without much appetite. Seeing the options more clearly now, Xavier asked quietly. Clara sighed. "It's not what I hoped. Even with Papa's savings, starting over seems almost impossible." Xavier was silent for a moment, then said, "My offer still stands. No pressure, but it's there." Clara met his gaze across the table. "Why are you doing this, Xavier? Truly, you could hire help if that's all you needed." "Could," he acknowledged, "but that's not all I need." He hesitated, then continued, his voice low. "I've been alone a long time, Clara. Thought I preferred it that way. Then you showed up at my door, and suddenly the quiet that used to feel peaceful just feels empty." "So you're lonely," Clara said softly. Xavier shook his head. "Was never lonely before. Didn't know what I was missing." He reached across the table, hesitantly covering her hand with his. "I'm not good at this, talking about feelings, but I know what I want now, and that's you staying." Clara felt warmth spreading through her at his touch, his words. There was a raw honesty in them that touched her deeply. "And if I stay," she asked carefully, "what exactly are you offering? What would I be to you?" Xavier's gaze was steady. "Whatever you want to be, a partner in the ranch, certainly. A friend, I hope. And maybe in time, something more if that's what you want too." Clara turned her hand beneath his, their fingers interlacing. "I need to be clear about this, Xavier. I won't be a housekeeper who warms your bed. If I stay, it has to be as an equal." "Wouldn't want you any other way," Xavier replied without hesitation. A throat cleared nearby, and they both looked up to find the waitress standing by their table, an amused expression on her face. Clara withdrew her hand quickly, her cheeks flushing. "More coffee?" the woman asked. "No, thank you," Clara replied. "We should be going." Outside, they walked the main street in companionable silence, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Clara found herself studying the town with new eyes, not as a place where she might rebuild her life, but as a community she might become part of alongside Xavier. At the edge of town, they passed a small church with a cemetery behind it. Clara paused, her thoughts turning to her father's solitary grave by their ruined homestead. "What is it?" Xavier asked, noticing her distraction. My father, Clara replied softly. I hate the thought of leaving him there alone, if I were to stay with you, I mean. Understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes. We could move him, he suggested. Bring him to rest near my place, or here in the town cemetery if you prefer. The simple offer, made without hesitation, settled something in Clara's heart. You would do that. Of course, Xavier replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He's your father, should be laid to rest properly, wherever you decide to make your home. Clara studied him for a long moment, seeing beyond the reserved exterior to the deeply decent man beneath. Let's go home, Xavier, she said finally. His eyes widened slightly. Home? Clara nodded, her decision made. Home, to your cabin, our cabin, if you meant what you said. The smile that transformed Xavier's usually solemn face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. I meant every word. They rode back to the ranch with a new sense of purpose, the future suddenly opening before them like an unwritten page. Clara felt a curious mixture of anxiety and excitement. This was not the path she had envisioned for herself, yet something about it felt right in a way she couldn't explain. The following day, they returned to Clara's homestead one last time. With Xavier's help, she carefully exhumed her father's remains, wrapping them respectfully in a clean sheet. They would take him to the ranch, where Xavier had already chosen a peaceful spot beneath a stand of oak trees for his final resting place. As Clara placed a handful of wildflowers on the newly dug grave that afternoon, Xavier stood beside her, his hat in his hands. He would have wanted you to be safe, he said quietly, to have a home. Clara nodded, blinking back tears. He would have liked you, I think. Papa appreciated straightforward men who meant what they said. High praise, Xavier replied. I'll try to live up to it. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Clara finally asked the question that had been on her mind since the night of the storm. That first night, she said hesitantly, when I was falling asleep, did you say stay forever? Xavier looked up from his whittling, surprise flashing across his features. You heard that, Clara nodded. I wasn't sure if I'd dreamed it. Xavier set aside his carving, his expression thoughtful. Didn't mean to say it aloud. Was just a thought that came to me watching you sleep. Something about it felt right, you being here. It was a bit forward, Clara pointed out with a small smile, asking a woman you just met to stay forever. Never claimed to have good manners, Xavier replied, the corner of his mouth lifting, but I meant it even then. Clara moved to sit beside him on the bench, their shoulders touching lightly. I'm beginning to think I might want to, she admitted softly. Stay forever, that is. Xavier's hand found hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Good, he said simply. That's good. The days stretched into weeks as April gave way to May, and Clara and Xavier settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. They worked side by side during daylight hours, Xavier teaching Clara about the cattle operation while she introduced improvements to the cabin and surrounding garden. Evenings were spent in companionable conversation or comfortable silence, each becoming more attuned to the other's moods and needs. Xavier had constructed a second bed frame, placing it against the wall opposite his own, giving Clara the privacy and propriety she required. The arrangement was temporary, they both understood, but necessary as they navigated the gradual transformation of their relationship from one of convenience to something deeper. It was during a spring roundup in late May that Clara first recognized the depth of her changing feelings for Xavier. She had insisted on joining him, and the two hired hands he'd brought on for the season, determined to learn every aspect of the ranch operation if she was to be a true partner. The work was grueling long hours in the saddle under the relentless Kansas sun, driving reluctant cattle toward the branding area. Clara's muscles ached in places she hadn't known could ache, but she refused to complain, matching Xavier's stoic endurance with her own determination. On the second day, one of the young steers broke from the herd, charging toward a ravine where it might escape. Without hesitation, Xavier spurred his horse after it, moving with such fluid grace that Clara found herself momentarily transfixed. Man and horse seemed to function as a single entity, cutting expertly to head off the steer's escape. Just as Xavier maneuvered the animal back toward the herd, His horse stepped into a prairie dog hole, stumbling violently. Xavier was thrown, landing hard on the sun-baked earth with an impact Clara could almost feel from 50 yards away. Her heart seemed to stop as she watched him lie motionless for several seconds. Then, to her immense relief, he rolled to his side and slowly pushed himself to his feet. Clara was already racing toward him, fear tightening her throat. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. Xavier grimaced, dusting himself off. "Just winded, maybe a bruised rib." "You could have broken your neck," Clara said, her voice sharper than intended as relief gave way to retroactive fear. Xavier looked up, surprised at her tone. "Hazard of the work," he replied. "Happens to everyone sooner or later." "Well, it shouldn't happen to you," Clara insisted, her hands moving of their own accord to check him for injuries, brushing dirt from his shirt, lingering perhaps longer than necessary. Xavier caught her wrist gently. "I'm fine, Clara," he said, his voice softer. "Really?" Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Clara suddenly became aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand on her wrist, of the intensity in his gaze. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "I noticed," Xavier replied, a rare smile touching his lips. "Didn't know you cared quite that much." "Neither did I," Clara confessed, "until I saw you fall." They might have stayed that way longer, the cattle momentarily forgotten if one of the hired hands hadn't ridden up, leading Xavier's horse. "Everything all right, boss?" the man called. Xavier released Clara's wrist, stepping back slightly. "Fine, Jim, just took a spill." The moment passed, but something had changed between them, a threshold crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, as they sat by the campfire with the hired hands, Clara was acutely aware of Xavier's presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers as he passed her a plate of beans, of the way his gaze lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. When they returned to the cabin 2 days later, the roundup complete, the subtle shift in their relationship persisted. There was a new awareness between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of deeper feelings growing beneath the surface of their practical arrangement. It was Clara who finally broached the subject one evening in early June as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "I've been thinking," she began, her hands busy with the mending in her lap. "Dangerous pastime," Xavier commented mildly, though his tone was teasing. Clara smiled, setting aside her sewing. "About us, this arrangement." Xavier's expression grew more serious. "Having second thoughts?" "No," Clara assured him quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. I'm happy here." "Happier than I expected to be." Some of the tension left Xavier's shoulders. "Good, I am too." "But I've been wondering where this is leading," Clara continued, gathering her courage. "When you asked me to stay, you said I could be whatever I wanted to be here, a partner in the ranch, a friend, or something more." Xavier set down the piece of wood he'd been whittling, giving her his full attention. "I remember. I think I know now what I want to be," Clara said softly. "If the offer still stands," Xavier's gaze intensified. "It does." Clara took a deep breath. "I want to be your wife, Xavier, not just your partner in business, but your partner in life, if that's what you want too." The transformation of Xavier's expression was remarkable surprise, giving way to a joy so pure and unguarded that Clara felt her breath catch. In that moment, the typically reserved man was completely open to her, his feelings written plainly across his features. "It is," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God knows it is, Clara." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned through years of ranch work. "I've wanted to ask, but I was afraid it was too soon, that you might still see this as just a practical arrangement." Clara shook her head, twining her fingers with his. "It might have started that way, but it's been more than that for a while now. I just needed time to be sure." "And you're sure now?" Xavier asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. In answer, Clara leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief, sweet contact that nonetheless sent warmth coursing through her veins. It was her first kiss, and though inexperienced, she put all her certainty into the gesture. When she pulled back, Xavier's eyes were wide with wonder. "That's a yes, then," he asked, a smile breaking across his face. Clara laughed, joy bubbling up from some deep wellspring inside her. Yes, Xavier Irons. That's a yes. His arms encircled her then, drawing her close as his lips found hers once more. This kiss was different, deeper, more assured, his hand cradling the back of her head as he showed her without words how long he had waited for this moment. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. Should we ride into town tomorrow? Speak to the minister, Clara nodded, her heart full to bursting. Yes, though I'd like a proper church wedding if you wouldn't mind waiting a few weeks. Nothing elaborate, but something more than just signing papers. Whatever you want, Xavier agreed readily. Though I'll tell you now, I'm not much for fancy clothes or big celebrations. I wouldn't expect otherwise, Clara replied with a smile. Just us, a few witnesses, and God's blessing. That's all I need. They were married on a bright July morning in the small Concordia church, the windows thrown open to admit the summer breeze. Clara wore a new dress of pale blue cotton with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Xavier had surprised her with a gold band that had belonged to his mother, a simple circle that nonetheless represented a promise as vast as the Kansas sky. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, attended by a handful of neighbors and the two hired hands who had worked the spring roundup. Afterward, they shared a modest meal at the hotel before riding home together as husband and wife. That night, as stars appeared in the velvet darkness above their cabin, Xavier led Clara across the threshold with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irons," he said softly. "I've been home for months," Clara replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Since the night you opened your door and said stay forever." Their coming together that night was a culmination of the trust and affection that had grown between them over the preceding months, tentative at first, then giving way to a passion that surprised them both. In Xavier's arms, Clara discovered a depth of feeling she had never imagined possible, a connection that transcended the physical to touch something profound within her soul. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Xavier traced lazy patterns on the bare skin of her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked simply. Clara smiled against his chest. "Completely? You? More than I knew was possible," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Summer flowed into autumn, and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Xavier's cattle business expanded, while Clara established a thriving vegetable garden and began selling excess produce in Concordia. Together, they built a larger chicken coop and added a room to the cabin, planning, Xavier said with a meaningful glance, for the future. That future arrived sooner than they expected. By Christmas, Clara was certain she was with child, a fact confirmed by the town doctor in January. Xavier's reaction to the news was everything Clara could have hoped for: joy and wonder, mingled with a fierce protectiveness that manifested in his insistence that she reduce her workload as her pregnancy progressed. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," Clara protested one March afternoon as Xavier attempted to take over the bread making. "Humor me," he replied, though his inexpert handling of the dough made Clara laugh despite her irritation. "At least let me show you how to knead it properly," she said, moving to stand behind him and guiding his hands. "Like this, firm but gentle." Xavier turned his head to kiss her cheek. "Firm but gentle, I'll remember." Their son, William Daniel Irons, was born on a hot August night in 1879, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Clara fell in love instantly with the tiny, perfect being they had created, a child with Xavier's blue eyes and her auburn hair. Xavier, who had paced anxiously outside during the delivery attended by a neighboring farmer's wife, entered the bedroom with uncharacteristic hesitation. The sight of Clara cradling their newborn son stopped him in his tracks, an expression of awe transforming his features. "Come meet your son," Clara said softly, exhausted but radiant. Xavier approached the bed slowly, perching carefully on its edge as if afraid he might somehow disturb the miraculous tableau before him. When Clara placed the swaddled infant in his arms, his large hands trembled slightly. "He's so small," Xavier whispered, a finger gently tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. but strong, Clara assured him. Like his father. Xavier looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, he said simply, the words containing a world of meaning. For what? Clara asked, reaching to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. For everything, Xavier replied. For staying that first night, for taking a chance on me, for this. He glanced down at their son, who had wrapped a tiny hand around his father's finger. For our family. Clara smiled, happiness overwhelming her despite her exhaustion. I'm the one who should be thanking you, she said. You gave me a home when I had nothing left, and you gave me everything I never knew I needed, Xavier countered, leaning forward to kiss her gently. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, in 1881, and another brother, James, in 1884. The ranch expanded as Xavier's herd grew and his reputation for quality cattle spread. Clara established a small dairy business, her butter and cheese becoming sought after in Concordia and beyond. They built a larger home adjacent to the original cabin in 1885, though Xavier insisted on keeping the cabin standing as a reminder, he said, of where we started. Clara understood the sentiment, often finding herself drawn to the small structure where their life together had begun. Not everything was easy. Droughts came, as did harsh winters that threatened the herd. In 1887, a prairie fire nearly reached their home, stopped only by a desperate firebreak and a fortuitous shift in the wind. Through it all, they faced each challenge side by side, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle overcome. By the spring of 1893, 15 years after the storm that had brought them together, the Irons Ranch was one of the most prosperous in Cloud County. Their children were growing. William at 14 already, showing his father's aptitude for ranching. 10-year-old Elizabeth demonstrating Clara's green thumb and determination. And 9-year-old James revealing a quick mind that his parents hoped might lead him to college someday. On the anniversary of the day Clara had appeared at Xavier's door, they rode together to the oak grove where her father was buried, now joined by Xavier's mother, whose remains they had brought from Texas in 1886. It had become a tradition for them, a day to remember where they had come from and to appreciate how far they had traveled together. 15 years, Xavier mused as they sat beneath the largest oak, a picnic spread between them. At 45, his hair was more silver than brown now, lines of experience etched around his eyes and mouth. To Clara, he was more handsome than ever. Hard to believe, isn't it? She replied, leaning against his shoulder. At 37, Clara retained the vitality of her youth, though childbearing and years of ranch work had softened her figure and added strands of silver to her auburn hair. Not really, Xavier said, his arm encircling her waist. Best decision I ever made, asking you to stay. Clara smiled, turning to meet his gaze. I thought I was the one who decided to stay. We both know I decided the moment I opened that door, Xavier replied with a rare grin. Just took you a bit longer to realize it. Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie that had been their home for a decade and a half. Always so sure of yourself, Mr. Irons. Only about you, Mrs. Irons, he countered, dropping a kiss on her temple. Only about you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. In the distance, they could see their home, the original cabin and the larger house beside it, the barn and outbuildings, the cattle grazing in the pasture beyond. A life built together day by day, year by year. Do you ever wonder, Clara asked softly, what might have happened if that storm hadn't destroyed my homestead? If I'd never knocked on your door that night? Xavier was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the setting sun. No, he said finally. Some things are meant to be, I think. If not that storm, something else would have brought you to me. He turned to her, his expression serious. I was waiting for you, Clara, didn't know it, but I was. Clara's heart swelled with emotion as she leaned in to kiss him, this man who had been her shelter in the storm, her partner in life, her home for 15 years. And I'll stay forever, she whispered against his lips. Just like you asked. Xavier's answering smile was as warm as the day he had first welcomed her into his life. Forever, he agreed, holding her close as the sun painted the Kansas prairie in hues of gold and promise. That sounds about right.